Okay, Bonnie Young, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited and grateful to be speaking with you both.
Good, it's our pleasure. We think this is an incredibly important conversation. It's one that we've actually wanted to do for many months. We feel like, and potentially this is an issue that affects many church members, probably many of our listeners, and if not our listeners themselves, the loved ones of those listeners. So we are hoping that this can be both educational and supportive, and we're just really excited that you're here to talk about it. The issue, of course, that I'm speaking about is the issue of OCD and scrupulosity in particular. This is something that is near and dear to my heart as someone that has suffered from OCD and scrupulosity. And I just want to say to our listeners before you turn this off and just think, OCD is just straightening the pencils or whatever. I think there is a stereotypical version of OCD that often maybe doesn't give it the full, I don't know if credit is the right word, but the credit it deserves, because this is something that affects that truly does affect people's well-being in a lot of ways. And so maybe, Bonnie, just as a first question and a kind of way to get us rolling, could you kind of give us a useful working definition of OCD, of scrupulosity, and potentially, as you do that, dispel any myths or stereotypes that you might hear?
Yeah, um, wonderful question to get started. So OCD, right? The title or the label of OCD gets tossed around a lot, like, oh, I'm so OCD about this or that. So I think all of us have heard it, but when we actually understand it, we might be less inclined to throw that title or that label around. OCD stands for obsessive compulsive disorder. And I think in today's conversation, I'll be using OCD kind of as an umbrella term. There's different types of OCD. It kind of expresses itself in different ways. An obsession is an unwanted, intrusive thought or feeling or urge that is normally really distressing to the person who experiences it. It's not something that's invited. A compulsion is then an act, a repetitive behavior, whether that's like an external act or an internal act that's done to kind of respond to the obsession, aimed at reducing the anxiety that the obsession kind of elicits. And there are lots of, like I mentioned, OCD is kind of this umbrella term, but how this can be manifest is maybe the more stereotypical, like cleaning or contamination, symmetry, wanting things to be, perfectly lined up or organized, walking through the house a certain way, checking locks, but can also be manifest, which I think we're going to talk about more today, which is in religious ways. So worrying about sinning, worrying about worthiness in an excessive way. Having intrusive thoughts or intrusive feelings that feel like they're violating a religious code or a standard. And normally this is repeated. This isn't just, one thought or one experience that happens. This is an ongoing pattern.
So when you say that, I imagine that, it's possible you could hear that and say, well, I have thoughts that I don't want to have, or, I occasionally I'll think something unworthy or whatever. What's the difference between that in sort of a standard context and in an actual like OCD type of context?
Yeah. So I think it's important to normalize those unwanted thoughts. Everyone has them all the time. Thoughts that are not kind or are not pure. But the difference between that and OCD is, or an obsessive thought is, it feels very repetitive. It feels very intrusive. And there's an accompanying distress with it that does not feel easy to ignore or to escape or to brush off. Right? This is not, oh yeah, I had that thought and, oh yeah, I'm going to move on and I'm not going to think about it again. This is, oh, I had that thought or I did this thing and I'm feeling kind of wrecked over it. Do I need to confess this? Do I need to pray about this over and over and over again? So maybe a simple way to say it is just the emotional experience with an everyday unwanted thought versus an obsessive thought is very different.
And is it, could you talk about what compulsions look like with scrupulosity? Because I feel like a lot of times this may fly under the radar because we have such a rich religious vocabulary for repentance. And so it's easy to just make an OCD experience with scrupulosity make so much sense. Like this is godly sorrow, or this is Satan, or this is the spirit, and I'm supposed to confess to my bishop. And so I think it's easier to catch compulsions when the obsession is about contamination or something, and you're seeing that like your kid's hands are red, or they're doing something that is very obviously not normal. But with scrupulosity, and where it's such an inside battle, I think it would be so easy to just get through so much of your life making it all make perfect sense with the gospel. So would you talk about just what compulsions in scrupulosity specifically look like?
Yeah, they can vary. Sometimes it looks like confessing over and over and over again. So if you're a religious leader and you're having someone come into your office confessing the same sin over and over, maybe they come in once and confess the sin, they come in a second time and say, oh, I forgot some details. I need to include these details. And they're not experiencing relief or joy or peace from the confession, but it seems like it's actually kind of a cyclical thing where there's maybe momentary relief, but then long-term it's kind of dragging them down. That can be a compulsion. Checking in about behavior. So if like you're a parent and your child is checking, is this okay? Mom, is this okay? Dad, am I all right? Or a parent and your child is confessing something that you're looking at them and you're like, does this really need to be confessed? Right? Things that most people can kind of go through without thinking twice about it. Someone suffering with scrupulosity, OCD, can be just very, very careful, very meticulous about every action that they do, wanting to make sure that they're okay, that this is good. Other things that you can see is maybe looking at, right, I mentioned that some of the compulsions, the responses to the obsessions can be external, but many are internal. So this could look like, saying internal prayers, repenting internally. And it could also look like having a child or a member of your congregation look like they're just going above and beyond. Wow. Maybe their devotion is excessive, maybe that it's more than actually needs to be done. Did that answer that question?
Those are great. Yeah, that's really interesting. We have one of our children also has OCD, and I remember realizing it all at once that every day when we were coming home from school, they were telling these stories, which I just thought was like, decompressing for the day. And all at once I realized actually every story is a confession. There was one story in particular where they said they had talked to a teacher and the teacher asked what their favorite Dr. Seuss book was. And they said, I just said the first book that came to my mind and I don't actually know if it's my favorite. And I was like kind of laughing it off. And then I thought, oh my gosh, that was a confession. Like are you confessing? Like, do you feel like you have to tell me this? And they said, yeah, I do. And then all of a sudden I realized that's what we did every day. Like that was the coming home from school ritual, was just like taking these confessions. And it was just like what you said, it was just things that seemed like over the top, like being extra careful. And none of the things were, nothing they said was actually bad. But they were really concerned. Like, did I just lie to my teacher because I wasn't positive that was my favorite Dr. Seuss book? It was like that level of being so careful. So I think had we not had any experience with OCD, I never would have noticed that that's what was going on. So I get how easy it would be to praise that, even like, oh, you're so good for like really wanting to be that honest, and like, good for you for like having such a high bar for yourself. And I think that's something I went to therapy for too. When Tim discovered that this was OCD, I had to learn how to stop like making it worse, because I was primarily the one taking confessions and giving Tim all of the certainty that OCD craved. So it was really like something that I had to become educated about too, because I was like contributing to this spiral. Yeah, it was hard. Yeah.
And Bonnie, I wonder if too, sorry, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, it's so easy to praise that and to kind of feed into that cycle, especially if you're someone who's never struggled with OCD or scrupulosity. It can seem like, wow, you know, I'm doing a great job as a parent teaching my children to be honest, to be right. So you can kind of give yourself a pat on the back, but really, what's driving that is a very different thing than a desire to be, well, maybe a better way to say it is there's just so much fear that's driving that behavior that you would never want your child to experience. You would never, you know, wish that upon them.
Yeah, and you also recognize, I think, when you offer the certainty or, you know, the praise for the confession, that you see the relief from the person that you give the certainty to. And you can feel like, you have this really connecting moment or whatever. You get the confession, you say, oh, you're so good. And that is releasing the pressure valve for the person that just confessed momentarily, but it also reinforces the cycle. And in the long run, at least the way I understand it, is not helpful. Like those confessions, it seems like each time you get the certainty that you need, or you think you need, it's going to come back just as strong or stronger. And it's really learning to, as the person with OCD, accept the uncertainty, and as the potential comforter in that situation, not giving the certainty that will get you out of the cycle. And I wondered, Bonnie, too, if it's okay, if we could take a step back too, and just make sure we've got our definitions lined up okay.
Yeah.
So OCD itself this is the way I understand it, falls under the anxiety umbrella, and then scrupulosity falls under the OCD umbrella, along with several other types of OCD. Is that an okay way to say it?
Perfect. Yeah. Yep.
Is there any chance that you could talk about some of the other types of OCD and how OCD manifests? Because I don't want anyone that's listening to this to get through the entire episode and, you know, potentially have OCD and not realize that they have it. Like one of my goals with this is for people like me, you know, that didn't have any language around this, to potentially recognize something in themselves and be able to get the help and support that they need, because it can be so incredibly difficult and even, you know, traumatizing in some ways. And so could you talk about maybe some of those other types of OCD? And if you wouldn't mind too, I would love it if you could even be explicit about what some of the symptoms, I guess is the word, are. Even some of the difficult ones that may be difficult to talk about, because that's what I want people to hear. Like, I'm worried that people are having these thoughts and they just think they're just so depraved, you know, and they don't recognize that it's OCD. So would you mind going through maybe just some of those other categories?
Yeah, I'd love to. So, sorry, just kind of fell on my chair. Maybe I'll just walk through, I wrote down a couple of examples here that I think might be relevant, or at least ones that I've seen with clients that I've worked with. And also, I mentioned to you, Tim and Aubrey, at the beginning, before we started recording, that I've also struggled with OCD and scrupulosity in my life. So maybe I'll give some examples from that as well.
Please.
So I'll start out. When I was 8 years old, little 8-year-old Bonnie was really, really worried about safety and keeping my family safe. And it was this strange combination of you know, going to primary and hearing in primary that the spirit warns you from danger. And my little 8-year-old brain really latched onto that and kind of felt like, wow, okay, well, if I get a warning, I better follow through, because I want to be obedient to God, but I also want my family to be safe. So when I was that age, the OCD manifests itself in checking. So I would, before bed, I would have this thought, which I interpreted as the spirit telling me to check. Now I know it was an intrusive thought, but I'd go around my house, check the doors, check the locks, touch the outlets, check the windows. Then I'd go upstairs, lay in my bed, and do it all over again, right? Until I felt convinced that I had kept my family safe. So checking is one of the ways that OCD can manifest itself. worrying about harm, worrying about hurting someone or hurting something, right? Just this week, I was meeting with a client who put a closed pen on the sofa that she was sitting on. And she quickly picked it up because she was afraid that the pen ink, even though the pen was closed, was going to mark my sofa. So even really little things like worrying about hurting someone's property or hurting someone's feelings, right? Having a conversation with someone and then obsessing about it over and over. What did I say? Did that hurt them? Do I need to apologize? Maybe following through with those apologies. And even after the apology, still feeling really weighed down with this guilt of, have I really harmed this person? Yeah. Having maybe violent or really disturbing thoughts or images come to mind. So working with some new moms, hearing some of what they're experiencing postpartum. So thinking about harming their baby, strangling their baby, throwing their baby off of a ledge, right? I mean, as a new mom, you're having these thoughts and you're asking, what kind of a monster am I, right? Being able to distinguish between that and this is your brain, right? This isn't you, this is your brain, can be really relieving. Intrusive sexual thoughts. So even and especially sexual thoughts that might be kind of religious in nature. So thinking something sexual about a religious figure, about Jesus or God. An acquaintance once mentioned that when they went to the temple, all they could think about were penises, right? Men's genitals. Not something that she would have ever invited, right? She was probably going to the temple to get help with that because she thought that this was something that she had power over, something that she had control over, but it just didn't quite understand at that point what this really meant or what this really was. Mm-hmm. There's a few examples of what this might look like.
Yeah, one that I've heard about too, and that I think could be potentially the most distressing is when, I mean, you potentially could combine a couple of those with pedophilia OCD. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, potentially this could manifest itself, especially again in tandem with scrupulosity or with missionaries, et cetera, who in my case on my mission, and I think this is still the case, it was very, very important to, not have any physical contact with children, shake their hands, but you would definitely never have a child on your lap or anything like that. And I worry about, and I have talked to missionaries where those rules have turned into obsessive thoughts, and people actually start to believe that they're pedophiles, and that I can't imagine anything much more distressing than that, or something that is potentially more difficult to talk with anyone about. Even with a therapist. I would imagine that you, and I'm making stuff up here, but that you have clients that have suffered from this, that it was very difficult, and maybe in the first session or first several sessions it was something they couldn't talk about.
Definitely. Or 5th or 10th session. I mean, there is so much shame and fear around that, and the truth is that the people who are feeling this fear around it, the people that are suffering this way, are people who would never ever do something to harm a child, right? Yet not being able to distinguish, not being able to discern that this is not me, this is not a desire I have, this is not something I want, I'm not choosing this, and actually believing that these thoughts are coming from me. Maybe these thoughts are coming from in kind of a deep dark place inside of me. These are my true feelings coming through. Can just feel absolutely haunting, and can cause these people to avoid situations that will really just kind of interrupt their life, right? A father or a mother who feels like when they are changing their child's diaper, and they see their child's genitals, right? And maybe having an unwanted thought or an intrusive thought or image come to mind, they interpret that as, oh, this is something that I want to do to my child.
Right.
Then they avoid that, right? They're avoiding changing their child's diaper because they feel like that is somehow prompting these thoughts to come. And so, right, that can lead to kind of really interrupting relationships, interrupting routines that are, really important for families.
Yeah.
Something that,
go ahead, Aubrey.
I was going to say something that we learned early on that brought me a lot of peace too, was just learning that a lot of times OCD themes revolve around what you care about most. And so as we kind of like move through our life, it was nice to be able to expect that when there was this new stage, that we could expect OCD to adapt, and we could expect new obsessions to arrive that had to do with whatever new thing we cared about most. And so I think I hope it is kind of relieving to know that, if it weren't so taboo, it probably wouldn't be a theme for you. If you didn't care so much, it probably wouldn't be a theme. And I saw just today, I saw some statistics about religious OCDs specifically, and it said that even though I think generally for OCD populations, it's something like only 5 to 30% suffer from religious OCD, but within religious community, like strict religious communities, that number skyrockets to like 50 or 60%, which I think just kind of affirms that if you care so much about being pure and being moral and right with God, then that is kind of where OCD may focus, and in a way that's sort of like, I hope that's it's kind of assuring that like you're a good person and like you're not choosing to have these thoughts. And Tim, I wanted to hear what you're going to say, but also, will you address, Bonnie, like we talk about controlling thoughts still. Like we talk about, you've got to sing a hymn and like choose to have virtuous thoughts and let virtue garnish their thoughts. Like our vocabulary around thoughts are so much about control. And so I think it's so hard to unlearn that, because you just start absorbing very early that like it is your fault if you're having bad thoughts, and you must be letting them in somehow, or maybe you're not worthy of the Spirit and that's why you can't control them. So if you could address like, how can we talk about thoughts, whether you have OCD or not? Like is it ever helpful to give people the impression that you are in control of of the thoughts that pop into your mind?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question, and one that I feel like I could talk about all day. I want to be careful when I'm answering this, because I think it's a mistake to say that we have no control over our thoughts. But I also know, and I've seen with my clients personally, that there's kind of this paradoxical relationship between trying to control something and then have it control you.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
That I lean a lot on the wisdom that's found in the tradition of Buddhism, in mindfulness, this idea of acceptance versus trying to push something out of your mind. I've got so many thoughts running through my head right now. So let me try to organize it. So when you're speaking to an audience, a group, whether that's your family or church, right, you are speaking to many different needs. So in that audience, in that group, there's probably someone who might actually need some correction, who might need some help, encouragement to be a little bit more obedient. But then there also might be someone in that congregation who is doing the very best they can and is harder on themselves than you would wish, or you could even imagine, and you would be heartbroken to see how hard they are on themselves. So if you're telling a group of young people, for example, to control their thoughts, there's going to be someone who can hear that and be like, yeah, whatever. And then there's going to be someone who's listening to that, and they're going to make a list of 20 unworthy thoughts that they've had that day, and then feel like they need to go confess them. Yeah. So I think we just need to bear in mind that that diversity, the diversity in our congregations, in our families, and keep those people in mind. I think when we use examples like your mind is a stage, or you can control your thoughts, that might be actually really helpful for some people. It can also be really damning for others. And the approach that I try to use with my clients and also personally is one of acceptance that, right, all of us have thoughts that we don't want to have, and in a very large part that are out of our control, completely out of our control. And sometimes we can control what to do with those thoughts. Sometimes it's our brain tricking us. Sometimes it's a glitch in the brain and it's not something that we have control of. And sometimes when we even try harder to control those thoughts, they're going to come back even harder. And that's when we can go get help. That's when we can recognize that this is not a spiritual problem. This is a mental problem. This isn't something that you're going to be able to manage with prayer or scripture or confession or temple attendance, right? This is something that you might need extra help with, therapy, medication, right? Another way to deal with this, because this is not a symptom of spiritual weakness or sin.
I can really attest to that, because the time that OCD was the biggest struggle for me was on my mission. And basically, all of the types of OCD that we've talked about so far, plus some others, which I think might be worth talking about as well, manifest themselves at some point for me on my mission.
Yeah.
And I remember learning, I think there was a manual, some kind of manual with a quote from Boyd K. Packer that I took to heart early on my mission that talked about singing a hymn, when you had what you considered to be an unworthy thought. And I would, I tried to take that advice, and because the part of the quote was like, if you sing the hymn, something worthy and unworthy can't exist in your mind at the same time. And I was like, okay, all I care about is getting rid of what's unworthy. And like, if that promise is true, then, I've found the antidote here. And so I would sing these hymns in my mind. And I mean, as embarrassing as this is to say, because I still feel an incredible amount of shame about this. The words of the hymn, the images in the hymn, the general subjects of the hymn would mix themselves up in my mind in some, what I consider to be very perverted way, to again get me back to sort of what we were talking about with the religiosity and religious figures type of OCD. And that then caused even more dissonance because, in any normal person, I've heard Boyd K. Packer say that you can't mix worthy and unworthy in your mind at the same time. And I seemed to be the exception to that rule. And so, yes, there was no question in my mind when I was a missionary that I was a monster, that I was completely depraved, that no one had, and part of the problem is because we talk about this so little, that when people are going through it, they think they're the only ones. And it's just so unusual. It's so it's not unusual for the record, but it appears to be, because of our lack of talking about it, so unusual that we, like, people that suffer from OCD start to think that they're truly the only ones that have ever gone this far down this path of depravity. And so for me, and I've talked about this a little bit, we talked about this with Richard Osler, but for me, what that meant was I was completely beyond any ability to repent, any ability to have my sins forgiven. And like, it's so sad. Obviously this was all happening inside my head. Like, I didn't have any sins that were, like, from an external perspective, something that even needed to be repented of or confessed or whatever. But I had gone so far down this path that I knew for a fact that I was, and without getting like, obviously we have our specific theology around heaven and hell, but like, in my mind, to put it simply, I was going to hell. And the only sort of redeeming factor that I had as a missionary was that I would be able to potentially share the truth with others so that they didn't share my fate. And that was just, that's just a very, very unhealthy place to be. And I wonder, this is kind of, I guess I'm rambling a little bit here, but I just want to convey, empathy for people that are suffering with this, because it's by far the hardest thing I've ever gone through. And people, I just don't want, people to, I think it's inevitable. I don't want people to roll their eyes when they hear, oh, OCD is the hardest thing you've ever gone through, but it can be truly severe, like truly, truly severe. And when we were having our discussion on depression with Jane Clayson Johnson, I mentioned this, but I'm not sure, what the formal definition of suicidality is, but like, I definitely wanted to die. Like I hoped to get hit by a bus, that type of thing. Not that I had any plans to do so, but again, like what we talked about, the harm OCD was a big part of what I was dealing with. I was convinced that I was a danger to society in a variety of ways. And so for me, my quote unquote suicidality, and I don't want to minimize what other people's experience of suicidality by any means, because I'm not even sure that I'm using the term correctly, but my desire to die was in part because I was worried that I was going to hurt other people, and that's a very unhealthy and difficult spot. It's a difficult thing to believe about yourself. And so I don't really know where I'm going with this.
I'll comment on that, Tim.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, and you are not alone. I was looking at some research from the American Psychiatric Association from the last DSM, which is the manual for mental health diagnoses, and the statistics that I found there is that about half of people suffering from OCD will have suicidal thoughts. So, right, this is something that feels unbearable, something that it would be relieving to die, to be able to escape how haunting and intrusive these thoughts are. And that about a fourth of people that suffer with OCD will make an attempt, a suicide attempt. So this isn't something that's a mild mental illness. It can be, but it can also be very, very serious, very painful.
I read too that the average age of onset is 19 or 19 and a half. And so it seems like, I just can't imagine this coming on while you're living away from your support system on a mission in the most rigid environment that you've probably experienced in your life up to that point. So are there any things that come to your mind that would make missions just a more comfortable place for someone who has OCD, or maybe even specifically, are there things that a mission president should be watching for? We've talked before about what a great mission president Tim had, but like, had he ever even heard of OCD, he would have known, like, when Tim, like day one, like he would have been able to see it. And so maybe it's just about education, but so are there things that you would love to tell every mission president? Like if you get a mission or a mission president's wife, if you meet a missionary and you see this, like this is something you need to look at.
And just to personalize that a little bit too, like Aubrey mentioned that we have a child that suffers from OCD, and I have an incredible amount of hesitation about sending them on a mission because I know, I know what my experience was. And like, to be honest, I can't think of another word other than torture to describe those 2 years. Like I know so many people had such wonderful experiences on their mission. And I think, I did grow in a lot of ways. But like every day I woke up and I was like, I can't believe that this is what my life has become, and it was a complete, prison of my own making. I felt like inside my head, and I can't imagine sending my own child out to have that experience. Like, I don't want to be, sometimes I worry about our generation being a little bit, a little bit too soft. Like we've got to, our kids have got to go through tough stuff, but like not this. I cannot imagine sending a child of mine out to have that experience.
Yeah. I think OCD loves certainty. And I think that we have a beautiful opportunity to be able to to introduce some uncertainty, to kind of push against maybe some of that rigidity that missions are the right way for everyone. I worked with a client who now is in his early 30s, and in his words, he said that his mission broke him. At the same time, it also kind of woke him up to this part of himself. And he was able to get the help that he needed. During his mission, his OCD was the most severe that it had ever been, and since has ever been. But this was also kind of a catalyst in his life for him to get help that he might not have gotten in the first place. He said a couple things that really stood out to me. He said that he got to a point on his mission after suffering, right, trying to be exactly obedient, and the character and the personality and leadership style of the mission presidents kind of fed into his OCD, right? This focus on exact obedience, no exceptions ever.
Yeah. Right.
People are going to lose their salvation if you mess up, if you don't do this many contacts a day, even if you're doing other good things during your time. So
Yes.
He started working with a therapist on his mission, and he said that he came to the point where he realized that what he was doing on his mission, the obsessive and compulsive things that he was doing on his mission, was never what God wanted him to do in the first place. And that he stopped believing in a God who would want him to suffer in the way that he was suffering. It was kind of this transitional point where he was able to kind of reassess and ask himself, who is God? What does God actually expect from me? Is this God that's requiring this of me, or is this something else? Is this myself? And he has kind of had this opportunity to navigate his relationship with authority in the church, kind of getting to a place where he can realize, I can be wrong. I'm not perfect, but I can also discern truth, and other people can be wrong too, even if they're in positions of authority. And getting to that point, I think developmentally, that's pretty hard for, I think, a lot of adolescents to do. Just brain development, we're not quite in that place as an adolescent. I think as we're emerging into adulthood, that's a belief, that's something that you can embody and kind of make sense of. And he's kind of transitioned to like this complete trust in authority. Everything that they say applies to me. I got to do for my salvation. To like a more realistic trust in authority, right? Not like jaded, but just a more discerning and wise. And so I think mission presidents can, I would invite all leaders, whether you're a mission president or a bishop, a young women's leader, a father, a mother, to try to encourage maybe more mature belief in appropriate ways. I kind of going back to that thing I said, every audience that you're speaking to is going to have maybe some people who need to, shape up a little bit, but then also people who are doing more than they need to. So just keeping that in mind. My husband and I lived in Barcelona for a couple of years while he was attending business school out there. And while I was there, I was working with the Barcelona mission under the mission president to work with missionaries suffering with scrupulosity. And him and his wife, Craig and Lark Galley, who are some of my heroes, they made this a priority. They educated their missionaries about it. They had workshops, trainings for their leaders, how to recognize this. They sent out educational material to their missionaries, and it was huge. A lot of the missionaries that I worked with were just so relieved to know this isn't what God is expecting. This isn't helping me. This isn't godly. This isn't good. These aren't good fruits. And just being kind of empowering them with this perspective of what scrupulosity looks like and then how to respond to it versus, doing the compulsion that the scrupulosity would want you to.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And you know, when I was on my mission, it didn't seem like, at least I was unaware of any mental health resources that might have been available to me. Is that more common now? Do you know, to have mental health available to missionaries, mental health, therapy, counseling, resources of any kind available?
I think it's becoming more common, and I hope that continues. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you were to, I love the idea that they're, sending out training materials, making this a real priority. And I'm sure, we have leaders, church leaders, bishops, stake presidents, branch presidents, mission presidents that listen to this podcast. And so if you were able to, give a, the 2-minute version of what are they watching for, how to recognize this, how would you explain that?
Yeah. Repetitive, if you're having missionaries come to you, or members come to you with a religion that is tormenting to them, and maybe you can't see it maybe that's not very visible, right? Sometimes I think we're all pretty good at hiding torment, especially as missionaries, as we're told to be like the examples of what living the gospel can look like.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that was such a big one for me, because can I just jump in there? Because
Yeah.
like, it's so hard when you're feeling those things, and to know that on the outside you have to be smiling, you have to be perfectly, put together, because again, like, what you learn is that if you're not doing those things, somebody might miss out on the gospel because they don't see how much it's benefiting you. And so there's an additional amount of dissonance that's coming, because like, I'm not feeling it, but I have to act this way, or else, there are eternal consequences for others.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I would encourage, so things to look out for them, is just if the efforts to live the gospel, if the efforts to follow the rules are leading to more suffering, that is probably an indication that there is some OCD or scrupulosity going on, right? I mean, the gospel, finding peace, living a peaceful life does include some suffering, right? Of course it does. We can't improve without some difficulty, but the difficulty that is experienced in scrupulosity is not something that God expects, is not something that is like a refining fire, right? It is hellfire. There's really, this is not something that is necessary to go through for growth. And this is not a test of your devotion, right? Of just sticking with this. God's not going to reward you for, sticking it out. He doesn't expect that from you. So I think a lot of it's difficult because a lot of this is internal. A lot of this you might never know. So I would say, as a leader, taking it upon yourself to create a culture where there's flexibility and there is mercy, and there is safety in talking about these things with you. If you're emanating a spirit of, toxic perfectionism, it's probably going to be hard for those missionaries to, or church members to come in and meet with you and be honest with you.
Yeah.
That's
Now,
a great answer.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. If you were, again, talking to a church leader, or even a parent who starts to recognize maybe some of these, some of these things, like a toxicity to the lived religion, or repeated confessions that, are for very minor things, or just repeated confessions generally that are over and over. And you start to say, okay, I've heard about this might be OCD or scrupulosity. What's your list of like things to do, and I guess things not to do?
Yeah. Things not to do is to play into the cycle, kind of like Aubrey was saying at the beginning. We're not celebrating this. We're not praising this. we're recognizing it for what it is. So number one step is just become educated, and then seek help, right? This is not something that is meant to be taken care of by reading a book and getting over it yourself, right? This is something that, right, I find that profound healing happens when we're able to share an experience with someone and they hear it and they say, you're not alone. Or they say, yeah, I've been there. Or I just had another client who said that very same thing, right? When we know that we are not alone in these things that can feel so shameful and so isolating, that is one of the biggest ways that we can seek healing. So yeah, that's not a very long list, but medication.
Important list.
Yeah. Medication is also something that can be really helpful for a lot of people. So talking to a doctor or a psychiatrist, finding a medication that feels like it's a good fit. And this answer might, I guess I'm adding a fourth thing to my list. When I was in Barcelona, again, my husband was attending a business school that was an initiative of Opus Dei, which is part of the Catholic Church. And so there was a priest on campus, kind of, I guess, the campus priest. I'm probably using a lot of wrong words. I need to get to know the Catholic Church better. But as I was working with missionaries and I had met this priest before, I thought to myself, I want to know, here's a man who has heard hundreds, thousands of confessions. And I bet he has some really good perspective on this, not so much from a psychological standpoint, but from a spiritual or a kind of a pastoral standpoint. And so I went and I talked to him and kind of picked his brain about scrupulosity, and something that he said stood out a lot to me. And this was that when people are suffering with scrupulosity, that in part this stems from a misunderstanding of the nature of God, of overemphasizing the justice and the exactness of God, and maybe missing the nurturing, loving, patient, gentle side of God, and being able to help his parishioners understand God's character, his fatherly character, is something that can kind of help that scrupulosity. Now that's something that, if I'm meeting with a client, that's not the first thing that I go to, but being able to include that and talk about, who is this God that is expecting these things of you? That's important. So as a parent, as a leader, making sure that you're also reflecting the love and the mercy that God has for these individuals in their suffering.
I love that. This to me goes back to some of the other discussions we've been having recently on Faith Matters, where I wonder if this is a way in which we would benefit from bringing more of the feminine divine into our religious lives in the way that we think about God. Not that I think we have any real understanding of, the specific attributes of a heavenly father versus a heavenly mother, but I do think if we allow that feminine side into our minds and our psyches and our hearts a little bit more, I think it naturally lends itself probably more to the nurturing and caring side of God, So, and I'm not making any particular statement here other than it's another way that I think we could benefit from more emphasis on that unique and amazing doctrine that we have of a heavenly mother.
Yeah.
And I keep thinking about what you said, Bonnie, about just like, is it asking yourself, is this fear motivated? Are you doing these confessions or these prayers over and over out of fear? And I keep thinking of 2 Timothy, and that God is not the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And it just feels like that is permission to go figure this out. Like that feels like the loophole for, okay, maybe I'm going to hold this thought that maybe I'm lying or I'm not, or I'm impure, because God is the spirit of, or God has given me a sound mind, and I want to go figure that out, instead of just letting my life be ruled by fear, which is, I think, what it can totally feel like. And I think this kind of brings us to exposure response prevention. And I wonder if you could just kind of give us a little overview. And I think it's so hard with scrupulosity specifically, because all of these obsessions are based in actual values. And so I think, if it's contamination, or if it's harm, or you're obsessing about safety, like that doesn't feel like you're going to put yourself out of alignment with what God wants from you. And I just feel like this is so tricky, because how do you do an exposure without feeling like you are willfully sinning, So could you talk about what exposures are, and how specifically does that apply to somebody with a religious version of OCD?
Yeah. So exposures, or exposure and response prevention, are some of that's one of the like first line interventions for someone suffering with OCD. It's basically this idea of like, to kind of put it crudely, like just facing your fears, but then practicing responding differently to them. So exposing people to situations that will provoke the obsession, or kind of inviting the obsession, like inviting the intrusive thought, inviting the thing that feels so scary, and then practicing not responding in the way that you normally do. And one of the goals of this is something that's called habituation, which is just a fancy word for just getting used to the feelings that come, and then kind of reducing your reliance on the obsession. So this is tricky because we never want to sin, right? we don't want to, like, and if you're a therapist and you're saying, oh, I'm going to have you sin right there, that client is not going to come back. So sometimes it's necessary to include a church leader in the therapy. Right. We live in a religion that authority and permission from authority is really important. And oftentimes we look to authority before we look to ourselves, or before we look to God to get our answers. Right. So while that might be something that eventually we'd like to work on changing, that's something we're just going to like work with right now, and help get the bishop or a parent, or I don't know, mission president on board with the treatment, right? That this exposure is not an invitation to sin. This is not an invitation to become a more carnal person. This is one of the best ways to decrease those obsessions, and to decrease your reliance on the compulsions that follow the obsessions. And this can feel, so uncomfortable for someone who is so afraid of what those obsessions, or what those, right, what that sin, and I guess this is a podcast, but I'm using quotes right now, might mean. But practicing it over and over and over can help someone wake up to, or get used to, the fact that this is actually not a sin, that they're actually not doing something wrong. And again, to kind of use some colloquial language, kind of this idea of reverse psychology. It's like, if you're choosing to make it happen, then maybe this is not something that is going to control you so much.
Which then gives you the freedom to make those choices. I feel like that's the irony, is like, you feel like you OCD is saying you can never mess up, like you can never ever mess up, and after exposures, it's like you finally have a little bit of freedom to choose to draw closer to God in that pure way if you want to, but like under the guise of OCD, like you really are being controlled. Like there's so little agency there, because you're compelled to be perfect. So I love that idea of just like creating a little bit of space, so that you are healthy enough to voluntarily have this relationship with God, if that's what you choose. And I just keep thinking of our little kid who has this, and just how hard it is that like there seems to be so little freedom to make those choices, because OCD demands so much. And it's been such a gift to start introducing exposures, and to see just like how free they are to be whatever kind of person that they want to be, which is a good person, but now there's like enough freedom that they can like really make those choices without the influence of OCD, which was so oppressive. It was like it felt like we were losing them. Like it was so hard to even see their personality at all, because OCD had like such an influence on every single decision. And so as like hard and uncomfortable as those exposures were for them, like that has been the gift of real freedom to be what they want to be.
Yeah.
We attended a like 2-day camp / conference put on by the IOCDF for kids with OCD a few weeks ago, and they played this amazing movie. We should probably link to it in the description, but it profiled several kids that had OCD, and one of them that was maybe the most memorable was a child that for whatever reason was tormented by the idea of like bodybuilders or like really, really big muscles. It was just it was something that he couldn't deal with. And like even like they described on road trips, like if he thought they were heading towards somewhere, you know, where he would see that, it would drive him absolutely crazy, and it just disrupted everything. And I want to make the point that if someone's listening to this and feels like they might have OCD, don't be afraid to go see a therapist, because they're going to say, oh, you're going to have to do an exposure and like, you know, face the worst fear you have right away. Because in this, and this video illustrated it really well, because the exposures really were baby steps. And, you know, and maybe Aubrey, you could help me if I miss if I miss things here, but like, you know, the very first step was, and I'm making this up a little bit, but like, you know, draw a picture of a flexing arm or something like that. And then it was like, okay, look at pictures of superheroes. And they kind of, and once those, and obviously that was difficult right at the beginning, which I know sounds crazy, but like, it's like, this is the thing that people with OCD deal with, where and it sounds like this couldn't actually be torment, but trust me, it really, these kinds of things really can be. And eventually, you know, it was all the way along all these baby steps until finally they went to like a Gold's Gym or something and the final exposure was like, find the biggest guy in the gym and go talk to him. And the biggest guy in the gym like was super nice, and like, you know, he shook his hand, and then once it was clear he was comfortably, like lifted him up and gave him a big hug. And like that was sort of the culmination of the exposures, but that wasn't day one, you know. That was very far along the chain. Once the person was already comfortable, like getting much more comfortable with the idea of facing their fears. And so I just don't want people to be hesitant about talking to a therapist, because obviously, and I'm sure this is a big part of your job, Bonnie, is making sure that the client that you're talking to is comfortable. You're not forcing them to do anything that they're not going to be comfortable with. It's going at their pace.
Yeah, definitely.
One that we did with our child that suffers with this was, so lying is a really big one for them. And so we found things like, okay, you know, tell me a story and just leave out some details. Like, it's not a lie. You just didn't tell me what color your shoes were when this happened, you know? And so that was something that felt like, you know, really innocuous, and it was easy to do and felt kind of silly to like know that there was this secret about the story. And it totally built up some momentum so that they felt kind of excited and like they had some power back, and then we could move the exposures along. And something else that I learned at this conference that was really important to I thought was that they said this is such a positive thing even if you don't have OCD. So if you have another child and you're wondering like, I don't know if it's officially OCD, like ERP is not going to hurt anybody. Like, it's a great way to deal with any anxiety. So, you know, if you're afraid of public speaking, and that doesn't have to be OCD, but you can start answering your phone when you don't recognize the number, or like, you know, doing something so little that you can handle. Like, it's small and they're little steps, and you get some momentum, and then, you know, pretty soon you're giving a talk or whatever. So I felt like that was really useful to know, and something that we've really incorporated with our whole family. It's a way to deal with fear so that nothing gets too out of control for anybody, even whether or not we even know if it's OCD. And I know I kind of mentioned this before, but just like one more plug for like getting educated, if you're the support person, if you're the spouse, to get educated. Because I think something that was really hard for me when I didn't know what it was that if you are the spouse or the person taking confession, like, you are in the position of being the devil on their shoulder, you know, in religious OCD. Like, my side of every argument was like, I don't know, it's not that bad. It's not that dishonest. Like, it's fine. And like, hearing yourself say that over and over, like, that was like hard on my self-esteem. Like, maybe I don't have the spirit with me. Like, why didn't I know that was bad? And like, he clearly like feels so convicted, and I felt nothing. And like, so it was really good for me to learn all about OCD and understand that, like, yeah, it wasn't on my radar, and that's not because I had offended the spirit somehow, and then I learned, how to talk about it, and that my role shouldn't be to give assurance and certainty, when those things come up. But that's the intuitive thing to do when someone you love is feeling tortured and you don't understand. Like, you want to gift them all the certainty in the world that they're a good person, but that was simultaneously, like, it hurt me, and it was totally contributing to this OCD cycle. So just a plug that, like, this is a family affair, and everybody needs to understand what's going on here so that you can actually be helpful, and so that you're not getting hurt in the meantime. Are there any other resources, Bonnie, that you would want to make everyone aware of? That movie that Tim was talking about is called Unstuck, and we just rented it. I think I can't remember the name of the website, but if you search Unstuck OCD, it comes up. It's like 20 minutes long, and it's the best thing that we've ever seen for kids and OCD. But any other, like, books or websites or podcasts that you would want to tell people about?
As far as stuff like in the church, there's actually been a few articles recently put out. I wish there was some more, but there's some things that have come out from the church. Just, I think they might only be online, but if you just search scrupulosity and the church, there's a few articles that have brought a lot of my clients a lot of relief, seeing that this is coming from the church.
From the church, yeah.
That can be really relieving. And yeah, nothing else that actually comes off the top of my head.
One, my favorite book, I think, is called Brain Lock, and it's by Jeffrey Schwartz. That one was like, I felt like that became sort of my encyclopedia for OCD. Love that one. Yeah. And then Natasha Daniels has done a lot of work with kids in OCD, and I loved all of her stuff. Her website is AT Parenting. Yeah, love both of those things.
The International OCD Foundation, IOCDF.org, has a lot of good resources, and that's the conference that we attended that we mentioned. But obviously, the most important thing that has helped me and our family is talking to people like you, Bonnie. It's actually going to therapy, and it can be like I said, it can be very difficult and shameful, because a lot of times these intrusive thoughts that you have are so difficult to talk about and are such taboos. Like, OCD loves to attack the most taboo things because they're what you care about not being or not doing, and so that, I think, that can prevent a lot of people from going and seeing a therapist. But like, and I mentioned this on Richard Ostler's podcast, but I don't think it's gone on ours, so I might as well do it here. Like, the final catalyst for me to actually go see a therapist was, and again, this goes back to what Aubrey said, that OCD seems to attack the thing that you care about the most in the world. And so for me on my mission, it was all worthiness stuff, a lot of like sexuality, that kind of stuff, because like I cared so much about being pure. Like, that was I felt like my number one responsibility as a missionary, other than the work that we were doing, like my internal responsibility. And so it attacked that just constantly. A few years later, when I was applying to grad school, I was applying to MBA programs, and I had a few programs that I was really excited about, lifelong dream type of thing to get in, and went through the whole application process, did the essays, did the application, and ended up getting into my number one choice. I was literally going to fulfill a lifelong dream of mine, and it was a really exciting time, and I had just been so focused on all of the application process, like the preparation, that in many ways, and I don't want to say this to downplay, the importance of family or anything like that, but it was very present for me, and it was sort of the most important thing that I was spending a lot of time on at that time. And so of course OCD decided that it was going to attack that part of my life. And after I'd been admitted, I got struck with this thought, just like out of nowhere, just one day, that I had cheated on my application. And the explanation that I had for it in my mind was that, just like going through any normal application process, I wrote my essays and then I sent them out to several friends to potentially edit them or give me feedback and advice. I got some of that feedback and advice, including changing things here and there, and I accepted some of it. and submitted my application just like everyone does. But I became convinced that, I mean, so I initially had that thought, maybe I cheated because I accepted some of this feedback on like, and those aren't, 100% my words. There was a little, I can even think of the word now that I chose to accept as part of this feedback that I wouldn't have probably used, all on my own.
What was it?
And
What was the
it
word?
was shoehorn. I don't know why, but like that was not part of my normal like essay vocabulary, I guess. But it described what I was trying to do perfectly. It was the word shoehorn as a verb. Like I'm going to shoehorn this thing in, and I was like, wow, I did not deserve to get in to my dream school because that wasn't my essay, which sounds totally. I mean, I think it sounds crazy now, but like I then felt like I had two options. One was email the dean of admissions and say, hey, I cheated on my essay. Like, I'm going to leave this in your hands. But even, in my sort of broken state of mind, I recognized how weird that would be, And so my other option was just don't go, just turn down the acceptance and not attend. And so that's what I was leaning toward doing. And Aubrey was like, yeah, no, you're not doing that, And she literally found an OCD specialist here near our home and set up an appointment for me. And I started going, and that was my absolute first exposure to exposure and response prevention. We had determined, Aubrey and I, just through sort of online research at this point, that what I had was probably OCD, but we didn't have any, any ways to deal with it. And I wasn't in any real way, obviously, given where this had gone. And I attended for the next, or not attended, but I went to therapy for the next few months before matriculation, and it really just turned everything around for me. Just understanding more how to deal with this type of thinking, because it's really counterintuitive. Like you want the certainty, and you seek the certainty, and you get the certainty, and that's the temporary relief. And so you think, okay, I just need more of that. But it's the opposite. What you need is to accept the uncertainty in so many different ways, or whatever the thing is you need that's bothering you. You need to expose yourself in some way to that thing, and it's just so counterintuitive. And I learned that for the first time by going to a therapist. And so, whoever is listening to this and is wondering, what the next step might be, I really just, despite all of these, great books, podcasts, other resources, I don't think there's much, and even church leaders, like, I don't think there's much that can replace, talking to a professional. And it's not, I would say not just any therapist, right? Somebody who really does specialize in OCD, and has clients that have gone through this and knows how to deal with it.
Amen.
Hang on just a second. I have to turn off this phone.
Okay. We'll edit this out, Bonnie. Don't worry.
Okay.
Oh.
It's a really fun ringtone.
Yes, that's our.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, that has happened one other time. It's like our safety kid phone, and like no one has the number, but like solicitors get it. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
Anyway, did you have one more question? Sorry.
No,
Tim.
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask Bonnie, is there a way for people to get a hold of you? Just where can they reach out if they wanted to?
Yeah, you're welcome to go to my website. It's just bonnieyoungcounseling.com.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other final thoughts, Bonnie, or things that you would like our listeners to hear about this subject?
Yes, actually, let me look here real quick. I wrote down some thoughts. Of course I can't find them right now.
No, you're good. No, we'll be getting the editing tools out. So
yeah, perfect. Yeah. Thank you. Let me see here.
I just never think to turn it off because we use it to make calls, not get calls.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe one more thought. So scrupulous behavior. Scrupulosity loves kind kind of putting a microscope on certain areas of our life, the places that we feel unworthy or we're doing something wrong, and is really good at kind of disregarding other parts of our lives, really unbalanced. And this happens personally. This also happens, I think, as a church, that sometimes we can kind of hyper focus on certain doctrines or certain principles, and then kind of leave out other parts that are quite complementary, or when included would make a more whole doctrine or theology. And I think that in the church we have a beautiful theology of balance and of duality. Tim, kind of like you were mentioning with a Heavenly Father and a Heavenly Mother, I think that when examined closely, like, it's there. Sometimes, though, we get really hung up or maybe hyper focused on works or God's justice or obedience, which are all good things, necessary things. But when we don't include grace and mercy and tenderness and kind of an acceptance of our fallenness, I think that leads us to getting in the pattern or being more inclined to kind of fall into scrupulosity. And so I think that there's a lot of hope. I think that there's so much potential in the church, in the way that we're talking about our doctrines and our beliefs, to include more balance. And so I guess I feel hopeful because it's there, and it's and I think we might have to dig a little bit for. I think we have some work culturally in the church to change, especially in missions or when we're talking to our youth about these things. But it's there. I believe it's there. So I feel hopeful.
That's such a great point. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Bonnie. And really, we appreciate you coming on and talking about this. Like I said, I really do think this is such an important topic that affects a lot, many more people than we know about. And I think a lot of our listeners and their loved ones, really will find a lot of comfort in your words and your thoughts here. So thank you so much again.
Yeah. Thanks, Bonnie.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Okay, we did it.
That was awesome.
That was
Thank
really,
you.
really good. You really are very articulate talking about these things. And I love I love the way that you're able to weave in a sort of mature understanding of the gospel, and not just that very rigid, obviously it comes along with the territory, I guess, of dealing with OCD. But I think this is really perfect.
That part that you said, that has never occurred to me, and it was such a good thought that maybe the answer in church is really developing some maturity around faith, because then you're able to move a little bit away from that black and white thinking. And that's the hardest part about OCD, right?
Yeah.
It matches up at church with this really black and white way of believing.
Yeah.
So that was such a good answer. I've never really thought about it.
Yeah, totally. Institutionally, we have OCD,
Yes.
And it's tricky because you, in one of your questions you asked, I think it was your last question, is avoiding church altogether a solution?
I forgot I was going to ask that. Yeah.
And that question really struck me. And I think any behavior that engages with an obsession normally reinforces it, right? So even avoidance can be something that can kind of reinforce scrupulosity. So avoiding church isn't really, to me, that feels like it's motivated out of fear. And not being motivated out of deliberate choice of, this is how I want to live my life. This is how I want to deal with these scruples. And so going to church in a way could kind of be exposure. Having said that, I also think, I was imagining myself in your shoes with a child, let's say, who's going to church and has a leader who maybe is very rigid or literal, and there's not a lot of room in their Sunday school class or whatever it is. Would I send my child to that class where they are just going to be tormented and say, I want you to develop the maturity to be able to discern, right? An 11-year-old or a 12-year-old isn't going to be able to do that. And so I think for some people, it's important to develop certain boundaries. But then again, balancing that with, am I being deliberate about engaging in life? Am I avoiding all of the things that are gonna, trigger my scrupulosity, or am I engaging in a way that I want to, where I can practice my discerning and I can practice kind of interacting with these things and managing my anxiety? So I don't think that there's an easy answer there, but that question really fascinated me.
Wow, that is so good.
Wow. Yeah, that is such a great answer. That's a really good point. What you avoid
I'm
is...
like wondering if there's a way to work that out, because like we should have, I don't know. Aubrey, do you think it's worth it?
Can we just cut in that what she just said?
Yeah, but like we didn't really ask the question.
Bonnie asked it.
That's true. Okay, we might.
I don't know. I would love to squeeze that in. Yeah, if you're comfortable, because I forgot. I don't know how I missed that.
Or was that too off the cuff, Bonnie? Like, were you not?
No, that's fine.
Okay. If we can figure out a way to.
I would love to, because that is something I really, really worry about. Like, it's been such a gift to be home during COVID and just not have to worry about it. But like, and I really worry about going back. Like, we are doing so much work at home, and like, we're really just gonna like send them back? And like, I feel like we are initiating the backsliding. Like, go be in this place where you are going to be exposed to these really literalistic understandings of the scripture and of the scriptures and God, and like, hope you figure that out. I really worry about that. So that's a great answer. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Bonnie. I think this is so good. And when I get the recording, it just takes a minute to process. I'll forward it to you. And if you haven't, we're hoping to release it this Sunday. But if you want to listen and have any edits, just let us know. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
Cool.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I do too.
Okay. Thank you guys for
personally. Yeah, it was like, personally, it was great. It was so.
Seriously, we probably should pay you like $120 per day for this.
Not at all. It was. I love how open you guys are with your experiences. I mean, that is the most important part, is just sharing experiences. So thank you for letting me have this conversation with you.
Oh, of course. Okay. Thanks, Bonnie.
Thank you so much. All right. Have a good rest of your day. See ya.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.